Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft to the Camden Conference.
Thank you, Graham, for that generous but appropriate. We had a long discussion about what the introduction ought to look like. The stories about Kissinger came from me. But anyway, it's really good to be with you this evening. I was fortunate enough to participate in the founding conference of the Camden Conference. And it's wonderful to be back here with you. I also bring you greetings from Senator George Mitchell. I met with him yesterday and told him I was coming up here. He said that he had been invited, but unfortunately, he is, I think, even as we speak, off for his second trip to the Middle East. This is a very important time in our national life. As I looked up here, it reminded me of the great heritage we have, and of one time when I went down to Charlottesville and spoke at Monticello about the presidency. And I spoke in the library of Jefferson's home. And it was difficult for me to speak. It was so moving. But this is who we are, and this is what I think should give all of us hope, that difficult as times are now, that we can and will rise to the occasion. As Graham said, I'm supposed to talk about challenges facing the new administration, so there's a lot to talk about. My plan is, first of all, you have a wonderful list of speakers, much more impressive than I. I know most of them, and they will correct all of the errors of tonight. But what I plan to do is touch on, not dwell on, but touch on a number of topics, selective, not exhaustive, and leave it to my colleagues to amplify and correct them over the next 2 days. Hopefully my remarks will help set the scene rather than simply be confusing or, even worse, random, which reminds me of the story of the lady who went to visit her lawyer and talk about relations with her husband, and she said, "I've decided there's no hope. We have to have a divorce." And the lawyer said, "Well, do you have grounds?" And she says, "Yes, about 2 acres." And he says, "No, I mean, do you have a grudge?" And he says, "No." And she said, "No, we park on the street." So he said, well, I mean, let me get this. Does your husband, for example, does your husband beat you up? And she says, "Oh, no, I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning." So he says, "Well, what is the problem?" And she says, "Well, we just don't seem to be able to communicate." So I'll try to overcome that. Let me begin with a few issues which have both international and domestic aspects before I go, and I want to concentrate substantively on the broad area of the Middle East. But I have to start with some comment about the financial, now economic crisis facing us. I want to hasten to say I am not an economist, which is a blessing right now. But I think what this crisis has demonstrated is that we clearly have one world economically, and that what happens in one place in the world immediately goes around the world. So we have one world economy. We don't have one world political system. We have 192 members of the United Nations. So we're trying to deal with a global economic crisis with multiple political entities. Now, can we get together closely enough politically to deal with this single problem? It's not clear. Developments thus far are not promising. I think the G20 meeting that we had was in fact encouraging in the sense that people sincerely talked about meeting together. But there's been precious little, as near as I can see, focus on how to deal with this crisis globally. And instead, most of the emphasis has been on how to deal with it nationally. And when you see developments such as in our stimulus package, a Buy American requirement, that's exactly the instincts that each country will have, and it's exactly the wrong instinct. And it's what made the 1930s recession into the deepest depression we've ever had. But that is a threat that faces us now. Hopefully, we can rise to it. But we have little to deal with. The international institutions we have to deal with the economic situation, the Bretton Woods series of institutions, were put together in 1944 in a world which has long since passed. It is time now not only to get us out of the current problem, but to put in place a structure which will enable this multiple political world to work cooperatively together to manage a single global economy. And that will take leadership, real leadership. And it's leadership only the United States can provide. And this comes at a time when the recent U.S. general style of leadership has produced repugnance around the world. We have come across, not intentionally, but we have come across as unilateral and authoritarian. You're either for us or against us, or it's our way or the highway. And that makes it hard for people who instinctively, other countries, have turned to the United States as being a well-meaning entity trying to help solve the problems, to just another country. Another issue affecting the ability of the United States to lead is the whole subject encompassed by the general term Guantanamo. The psychology surrounding the Guantanamo subject may be the worst blow to the image of the United States ever. It's dealt us, and the image of the United States as somebody different in the world has been tarnished. But let me hasten to say that in this Guantanamo issue, there's a real problem as the new administration is beginning to find out. We have a criminal law to take care of ordinary lawbreakers. We have an international law to deal with the laws of war, prisoners of war, those kinds of things. We have nothing in our legal structure to deal with this in-between things. Non-state actors who are fighting as if they were military, but have no connection to organized government. How do you deal with them? What is the category? And while I think this administration the previous administration acted ad hoc in a way which was dangerous, you can understand they were grappling for a way to deal with a new phenomenon. Guantanamo, for example, was not an accident. It's perhaps one of the, maybe the only place in the world where there is no intrinsic legal jurisdiction. It's owned by Cuba. It's leased by the United States. The lease is in doubt. So there's no legal jurisdiction there. So there's no law which technically applies. Then there's, what do you call these people who are at war with us, but not on behalf of any political entity? We have coined the term enemy combatants. What's an enemy combatant? Well, nobody knows. And so we're struggling here. Do they have any rights in the courts? Don't they? If you move them to Guantanamo to the United States, we want to close Guantanamo, then they come under a set of legal jurisdictions which is entirely different. So there is a real problem here that we need to formulate a rule of law to deal with this. But in the meantime, these kind of overhang burden the new administration in trying to take hold and provide leadership in a positive way. I think the new president is trying. I think when he sent George Mitchell out to the Middle East and said, I'm sending him out to listen. That didn't mean much to Americans. To the Middle East, that's a profound statement, out to listen, not to preach. Now, that's enough about domestic-oriented foreign policy. Now, let me look outward for a few minutes. We live in a very different world from those of you of my generation who spent most of our active lives in the world of the Cold War. There has been a discontinuity of history from the end of the Cold War. Now, it didn't all happen to the Cold War, but that sort of marked it. The world of the Cold War was a world where we were afraid a serious mistake would result in a nuclear holocaust which would destroy the planet. But that resulted in actually a very tidy world. We had a single enemy. We knew what they were about. We knew what we needed to do. We had some trouble doing it sometimes. We knew what we needed to do, and both sides knew that a serious mistake could be catastrophic. So it was a very careful world. Then suddenly, historically, in the blink of an eye, that world disappeared. And it was replaced by an entirely different world. The threat of a nuclear holocaust was gone. What a big sense of relief. We didn't have to worry about that anymore. It was replaced by 100 or 1,000 pinprick problems relative to a nuclear war. But we weren't prepared for them because we had spent 40 years focused on a single target. Our intelligence community, for example, focused, they knew a lot about the Soviet Union, what they thought, how they reacted, all of their systems and so on. Suddenly, it's gone, and instead, there are almost 200 states, some of which we don't even have intelligence representation in. We didn't know where the threats were coming. Who would have thought that the proximate cause of the World Trade Tower attack would come from Afghanistan? That is the kind of nature of the change. And this was accompanied by seminal changes which were taking place behind the scenes, but came in full flower with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the change of power in the world, things like that. But primarily, what was happening, aside from the end of the Cold War, was described adequately, I think, by the term globalization. Fundamental changes in the way the world was organized and operated. National borders are eroding. The nation state can no longer provide for its citizens the way citizens are used to by itself. Issues of health, communications, climate change, all of these things cannot be dealt with by the nation state anymore. They require cooperation. They require reaching out to others. The financial crisis is, of course, one of the great examples of that kind of a problem. The whole nature of power has changed. All of you who in college took courses in the characteristics of national power, and you learned what makes a national power, the economy, the size of the military, all of these kinds of things. It's different now. Who would have thought that the United States, the most powerful country in the world, probably since the days of the Roman Empire, could be hogtied by a little two-bit country like Iraq? It's because power is different now. And the whole nature of it and how you can apply it and use it has changed. One of the other things that's changed, thanks to modern communications, is that the world's people are now politicized. For most of world history, the average individual knew what was happening in his own village and maybe the accompanying village. He didn't know anything beyond that and didn't care much. The problems of empire and so on went around him. It didn't bother him, didn't affect him. Now, practically speaking, everyone is in earshot of a radio, in eyesight of a TV, and so on. They know what's going on in the world, and they're energized by it. They're politicized by it. They react with love, hate, anger, envy, all of those things. And you should not discount the power of terrorism now. We've had terrorism for centuries, but it's different now because it's motivated by the politicization of people who see what's going on in the world and react to it. Accompanying that is a political atomization of states. And one of the best examples I like to use is Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a small country in an economic climate where size is important. Now, Yugoslavia is 6 itty-bitty countries. And that is happening everywhere. More and more intolerance for people who don't think exactly like you do, more and more tendency to withdraw into ever smaller, ever more homogeneous groups. That is not a movement which, however culturally it is rewarding to people, it's not in tune with the movement of the world and its economy toward greater and greater units. And lastly, the population, world population is growing fairly rapidly, but it's growing highest in areas where wealth is lowest. And that is going to produce additional trauma. So this is a very different world from that we're accustomed to. We're trying to learn how to cope with it. We're trying to learn with habits of mind that especially old folks like me have learned from the Cold War. I've mentioned the CIA. DOD is the same. And the Bush administration came in, transformation of the military, and it's been terrific. And we have never been in better condition to fight World War II. It's true. We have an awesome military force, but it was not designed, nor does it operate well, kicking down doors in Baghdad, looking for bad guys. And that sort of epitomizes the problem that we have. If you look farther afield, NATO. NATO is a wonderful military alliance. It is the first alliance that can really fight effectively together. But for what? The original purpose for which NATO was founded is gone. And it's not going to return anytime in its lifetime. Now, can we take that wonderful military organization and the political ancillaries to it and turn it to use in a world which is very different? We're struggling to figure that out now. And the last, of course, is NATO. NATO, the UN. The world cries out now for international organization to facilitate cooperation. The United Nations was built in 1945 for a world which has disappeared. It is ill-suited to the world today. But if we didn't have a United Nations, I suggest we could not put one together in the world today. It would not be possible. So how do we deal with it? It's a very complicated problem. When the UN was founded, it had 51 members. And they were all nation states with long histories. They were all similar kinds of entities. There are now 192 states in the UN. And most of the additional states either were non-existent in 1945 or were colonies of those 51. They have very different notions of the world and how it should operate. The UN is now in a state of internal contradiction with each other. Article 2 of the UN says, nothing in this charter shall give the UN the right to interfere in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of its members. And yet, we have what is called the responsibility to protect. And the Security Council has said unanimously that when a country cannot or does not protect major elements of its population from harm, it is the duty of the UN to intervene. Darfur is a great example. But those two are in fundamental conflict. And one of the reasons that Darfur has gone on longer than World War II is because we cannot resolve those conflicts. And people like the Chinese, who are worried about intervention themselves, say, no, the Charter forbids it. And we say the responsibility to protect provides it. So we're dealing with this very complicated world with at least one of our hands tied behind our back. This is the equipment that we have. Now let me focus just for a moment on what I think is perhaps the most vexing and critical area of the world, and that is the broad area of the Middle East and Central Asia. What has happened? It's been a troubling area for a long time. What has happened as a result of a bunch of things is that all of the separate conflicts of the area, not all of them, but many of them, have joined together into a series of overlapping problems for us. And it's very difficult to disentangle them. And it's very complicated to know how to react to them. I think there are three general areas. There's the Palestinian peace process, there's Iraq, there's Iran, and then there's the Afghan-Pakistan issue. I think that for U.S. purposes, the Palestinian peace process is perhaps the crucial element. Now, a lot of people say, well, what does that have to do, the Sunni Shia problem in Iraq, that's got nothing to do with Palestine. No, it doesn't. But Palestine has left a deep sense of grievance and injustice in the minds of the Islamic and especially the Arabic world. And psychologically, it may not be related to some of the others, but psychologically, it would change, I think, the atmosphere dramatically. Would we be able to deal with it? Now, can we? It's depressingly difficult. I think it would take the United States behaving in a way that we never have before in the area. And that is, we've usually said to the Palestinians and the Israelis, you sit down together, we'll provide the table, we'll facilitate, we hope you can come to an agreement. That's not going to happen. Neither side is strong enough now to have the self-confidence to deal with it. And indeed, when they get strong and have self-confidence, they don't think they need to make a deal. Instead, I think the United States has to be more assertive. The elements of a deal were pretty well laid out at the end of the Clinton administration by the Taba Accords. There are some important details and so on, but they're pretty well laid out. And I think it is incumbent on the United States now to say, here is our proposal. Here is our idea to save it, to solve the problem. We think you should adopt it. It gives both sides the opportunity to say, well, we didn't really like this part and the other, but the United States made us do it. So far, we've been unable to bring ourselves to do that because it's tough and it's against our instinct. The problem is more difficult now than it was at the end of the Bush administration for two reasons. We have Israeli elections, which have turned out to be so complex that it's not clear that the Israelis will be able to form a government. And the Gaza explosion has not only encouraged Hamas in a way, from their perspective being able to stand off the Israelis, but has also damaged the Palestinians, Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas, seriously. But I think the opportunity is still there, and I think it is critically important that we focus on that. Not that it solves all the problems, but it would psychologically turn the atmosphere around. It would steal some of the thunder from Hezbollah and Hamas, who feed off the grievance of the Palestinian people. One of the things we saw in the recent Gaza attack is refugee camps there. Those refugee camps have been there for over 60 years now. That's 3 generations of Palestinians growing up, fed by UN dole, unable to work, not allowed to work. If that's not a breeding ground for radicalism and terrorism, I don't know what is. That's what we need to do there. Iraq, I'm much more optimistic about Iraq. I think that we finally are adopting the right strategy, which is not to just kill bad guys, but to provide security for good guys. And the Iraqi army is moving along fine. What we cannot do is solve the Iraqis' political problem for them. I think we need to be tolerant, patient. I hope the new administration will not follow a calendar in how we draw down from Iraq, because we ought to draw down based on the situation in the ground. We have an incipient success, but if we leave prematurely, it could collapse easily. And our goal ought to be in Iraq, which is a force for stability in the region, not for chaos and conflict. And I don't know when that is. It's like when you have training wheels on your little kid's bicycle. Do you know exactly when to take them off? No. But that's what we're in now, and judgment is important. Iran. We have two problems with Iran. One is Iran and the region, and the other is Iran and nuclear weapons. The Iranians have every reason to feel very good about themselves. Our interventions in the region have removed all of their enemies, although the Taliban is reconstructed. But we destroyed the Taliban on their east, we destroyed Iraq on their west. They feel pretty good about things. They're funding Hezbollah, they're funding Hamas, and so things are going pretty well for them. I think we need to turn that around. But we need to turn it around in a certain way. Iran is not a monolithic society. And Iran is a multipolar. Iran has a radical group, revolutionary group, which is difficult to deal with. It also has a conservative religious group and a moderate secular group. And if you look at the Pew polls around the world, there's probably nowhere where Americans are more popular in the world than in Iran by the people. We need to work on that. Iran has a vital interest in what happens in Iraq. Iraq attacked them in 1980, and they fought a 7-8-year war. They don't want another one. Is there common ground? I don't know, but we'll only find out if we talk to them. And we need to go to Iran and say, we understand you live in a difficult world. You're a Shia country in a Sunni world. You're a Persian culture in an Arab world. And we're prepared to look at a regional structure in which you can feel secure. It might not work, but it might. Iran is now coming up on elections this spring. They have a very interesting choice of elections. Ahmadinejad, who gets his support by bashing the United States and appealing to Iranian nationalism, is going to run again. But also Khatami, a former president, who was sort of stepped on by the mullahs because he was too moderate, is running again. It's a very interesting election. And while, Iranian elections are very carefully circumscribed in who can run, they're pretty honest with the people who can run. So we need to play that. And I think we can do that before the elections in a way, not to try to interfere in the elections, but to present options for them. On the nuclear side, we don't know actually whether Iran wants nuclear weapons or whether they simply want their own controlled nuclear power. But in a way, it doesn't matter, because I think the important thing is that if Iran is allowed to go ahead enriching uranium, it gives them the potential for being a matter of a few months away from a nuclear weapon. If they do that, then almost certainly in self-defense, the Egyptians will do the same thing. Probably the Saudis, probably the Turks, and maybe 20 or 30 other countries around the world. That is not a better world for us. Can we do something about it? I don't know. But it seems to me we have not exhausted the possibilities. And I think if the United States, the Europeans, the 5 nuclear powers, the Russians, the Chinese, have a solid front, not the radicals, but the conservatives in Iran will think twice about proceeding willy-nilly. Now, how do we get that to happen? I think the real key is the Russians. The Russians don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but they don't mind us being tangled up with Iran. We have said we cannot allow Iran to have nuclear weapons, and yet we're building a missile defense system in Eastern Europe for when they do have nuclear weapons. Now, if you're a Russian, what do you think? What are those Americans up to? There's a contradiction here. I think if we go to the Russians and say, look, sincerely, this deployment is only as a last resort. If we can work together and avoid Iran taking these steps, we don't need that deployment. And you go to the Chinese, and the Chinese say, well, no, we don't want them to have nuclear weapons, but gee, they're a good oil supplier to us, and they're a good commercial customer. And we say, but look, suppose we're unsuccessful in dissuading Iran, and we feel we need to use force, and there's a Middle East conflict. What do you think that does to your oil supplies from Iran or anywhere else? Isn't it better for you to cooperate with us beforehand? So I don't know if it'll work, but it seems to me that there is a real possibility. I'm already over my time, and I've left the most vexing thing to the end, and that is Afghanistan and Pakistan. We are in danger of looking at Afghanistan as just a bigger Iraq. It is not, it is different, and our goals need to be different. We went into Afghanistan for one reason, and that is we could not dissuade the Taliban from turning over or driving out al-Qaeda. That's why we went in. We need to remember that. We didn't go in to remake Afghanistan, which has never been a modern nation state. And so we need to look. We need to be able to defend the Afghan people and build the army to do that. But we don't need to build a modern state in Afghanistan. And we need to look for non-military solutions to the Afghan problem. Pakistan is the country about which I have nightmares. It has never been able to grapple successfully with democracy. In a way, it got the short end of the stick in the split with India, in the sense that it got most difficult areas and the most tribal areas and so on. They have had 4 times, I think, civilian governments overthrown by the military for corruption or other kinds of things. The military straightens it out, turns it back to the civilians. That's happened 4 times. It is a very weak government now. Both the current president, the prime minister who's an acolyte of the president, and the leader of the chief opposition were former prime ministers thrown out of office for corruption. is very fragile, a lot of radicalism. We helped, or we encouraged Pakistan to train Taliban to go into Afghanistan against the Soviet Union when they were occupiers. So there's all kinds of problems within Pakistan stemming from that and within the army. I think we need to be understanding of Pakistan. We need to help where we can. It's a really, really tough question. But I certainly hope you'll ask your other speakers about both of those countries. Well, what I've laid out is a really daunting task, and it is a daunting task. This president faces problems, the complexity of which and the multiplicity of which have rarely been faced by an incoming president. Can we do it? The answer, I think, is yes. If we recognize how different the world is, and if we reform our approach to the outside world. I don't believe the United States has lost its energy. I don't believe we're a finished power by any means. And if you look at the introductory video, I think you'll agree with me. We need to find ourselves again. We need to restore what we really are and restore the ability to lead, not to dictate, to lead, to provide the focal point around which countries of the world can rally to produce greater things for this new world. That's our challenge, and I hope the new administration is up to it. Thank you very much. Thank you.